What if I told you that one of the most advanced warships ever built sank less than a mile into its maiden voyage? This is the story of the Vasa, a towering 17th century ship built to showcase Sweden's naval dominance. Equipped with ornate carvings, rows of fearsome cannons, and the ambition of an entire empire behind it, this ship was destined to be the pride of the Swedish fleet. But there was a problem. No one wanted to tell the king that it wasn't seaworthy. So how could such a catastrophic failure happen to a vessel designed with the best minds, the best resources, and under the direct command of the monarch? And why did no one dare to speak the truth to him? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the incredible story of the Vasa. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History on Location. Before we dive into the story of the Vasa, it's important to understand the world into which it was born. This wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of ambition and power during a time when Sweden was rising to become a dominant European force. But to help us better unravel this story, we're joined by Fred Hocker, the museum's director of research.
If we look at Sweden in the 17th century, it looks very different than Sweden looks today in some ways. Geographically very different, and it had a very large landscape with very few people in it. The entire population under Swedish control was only a little bit over 1 million people. But the kings of Sweden had ambitions, you might say, above their station, that they believed that Sweden had the resources and the capability to compete on equal terms with the larger, richer kingdoms to the south. The king of Denmark controlled the straits, the Öresund, the way in and out of the Baltic, and taxed every vessel coming and going, which gave him an income out of all proportion to his land. They gave him the freedom to do things without the consent of his own parliament, because it was personal income. The King of Sweden saw that and thought it would be a good idea if Sweden had similar access. And so that's the context for why Vasa was built. Sweden was engaged in basically an amphibious war on a hostile shore against Poland and Lithuania. It was convoying troops, trying to interdict trade, trying to divert trade instead of going to Polish ports to go to Swedish-controlled ports. And at the same time, being aware that they would have to defend themselves against the richer and more powerful country of Denmark, Norway. And so to do that, the King of Sweden embarked on a program of rearmament to rebuild his navy into something more modern and much more capable. Gustav Adolf's vision of Sweden's future involved a requirement for a standing navy of specialized warships. And so he began a program of consciously replacing the ships he'd inherited from his father with new up-to-date designs, heavily armed, designed as warships that would be available in peace or in war to further his political ambitions. The Swedish Navy in particular believed that the decisive moment in a naval battle would be boarding, would be hand-to-hand combat. So they believed that the primary weapon of a warship was its crew. The king had a very different idea. He was a keen artillerist. He had been a pioneer in what we call combined arms operations today. That is, integrating infantry, cavalry, and artillery on the battlefield to use them more effectively. And he was intent on doing the same thing at sea. And he saw that the future of naval warfare was not going to be hand-to-hand combat between men armed with axes and spears, but it was going to be artillery duels between heavily armed gun platforms. He was right, but he was about a generation ahead of the curve. So he started ordering a new type of ship in the 1620s. And instead of a ship with a single deck of guns, relatively light guns, he started ordering a class of ships that would have 2 fully armed gun decks, and those decks would be equipped with much heavier artillery. And the first ship in that class of ships, if we could call it that, was ordered in the winter of 1624-1625. A pair of Dutch entrepreneurs were contracted to build it, source all the raw material. And they laid the keel for the first of those ships in February, March of 1626. Ship was launched in 1627, probably late spring. And in fact, the ship itself was finished in the summer of 1627, but couldn't really be deployed because the king had decided that not only would this be a new type of ship, but it would have a new armament, of a unitary armament of all guns of the same type. Instead of assembling the armament out of what you had in store, he ordered an entirely new armament of identical guns cast for the ship. and discovered that you can build a ship faster than you can cast all the guns for a ship. And so that first ship, which was named by the summer of 1626 Vasa, did not sail until the summer of 1628 because it took an extra year for the foundry here in Stockholm to catch up with the order for initially 72 bronze guns for the ship.
So with this monster of a ship, I'm curious, what kind of planning went in? What was the design phase up to the construction phase? Where did they build it?
The ship was built here in Stockholm, underneath what's now the Strand Hotel, in the part of town we now call Blasieholmen, but at that time was just called the shipyard or ship island, Skeppsholmen. This was the National Navy Yard, although it was contracted to private or leased to private entrepreneurs. Raw materials were sourced from all over eastern Sweden, and in fact some material was sourced abroad. Timber for the ship was purchased in Riga and in what's now Kaliningrad and in Amsterdam. And from dendrochronology, we know that some of the timber they bought in Amsterdam actually came from what's now Western Sweden, but was then Denmark. So Sweden's two great enemies in the Baltic were Denmark, Norway, and Poland, Lithuania, and they were using the raw materials, the resources of both of those enemies to build their own navy.
So, Sweden sourced timber for the Vasa from across the Baltic region, including some areas that were technically enemy territory. Though, even with quality resources, the real challenge wasn't the wood, it was the design.
The basic dimensions were laid down in a contract, but the design methodology used by the Dutch shipwrights who were hired to build the ship did not require any drawings. You started with two key dimensions, the length of the keel and the maximum breadth of the hull. And everything after that was derived by proportional rules from those two dimensions. So the contract only specifies the ship should be 128 feet long in the keel and 34 feet wide.
But what about all the ornamentation and symbolism that's found within the ship? Was that planned out?
A warship is not just a physical warship. It's a gun platform, in the case of Vasa, but there's also a metaphysical warship that is a visible symbol or presentation of that nation's ambition, self-image, policy. And so the ship's appearance is part of its function, it's not decoration. A warrior standing with a shield and a sword, as you find on the bow of Vasa, isn't just a guy in armor with a sword. He represents an idea. In the case of Vasa, that particular warrior is standing in the en garde position with his shield raised in front of him and his sword behind his head. That is a defensive posture, not an attacking posture. Gustav Adolf always went to war claiming that he was acting in defense. He was defending the true Christian faith. But we don't really know a lot about the launch. We know that they launched the ship and then continued to build it and outfit it and rig it. But the king needed the ship to go to sea. He was actively engaged in the campaigns of 1628 by that point. And so eventually, in August of 1628, even though the foundry had not yet delivered all the guns, that Vasa never had more than 64 of its 72 guns actually on board. It was finally ordered to sea in the early part of August in 1628. We know from historical accounts that there were guests on board for the first day's sail, which would only have gone from here in Stockholm down to the other end of the harbor, about 12 nautical miles, to a place called Vaxholm, which would be the first night's anchorage. And that we know was a big festival day. Everybody in town turned out for that. It's the most powerfully armed warship in the world up to that point is departing on its maiden voyage, and everybody knows it's been a year of trying to get this ship to sea. And a lot of people also probably know it's not a very good ship. So there's probably some anticipation in the crowd.
What issues did they suspect could be wrong with the Vasa?
Clearly, while the ship was being built, the naval captain in charge of supervising construction, a man named Søfring Hansen, who was actually a Dane, who had come into Swedish service about 25 years earlier, suspected that the ship was not going to be a good ship. He saw that the ship was not very stable. It was tender, or even what we would call crank. That is, it couldn't stand upright under even light winds. And so about a month before the ship finally sailed, he invited the vice admiral in charge of procurement, Claes Fleming, down to the ship and had him watch while he ordered 30 sailors to run back and forth across the upper deck to show the admiral that the ship was not safe. And the ship started to roll, and it started to roll alarmingly. After just the third trip across the deck, the ship had rolled 3 planks under on the low side.
Was this the type of situation where they're like, this is scary, the ship is rocking all over the place, but I'm not going to tell the king?
That's pretty much exactly it. The admiral ordered them to stop the demonstration so that the ship wouldn't just roll over at the pier. And he was heard to remark that he wished the king were at home, because then the king could decide what to do. But he was fighting the war. The admiral then was stuck. He ordered the ship to sea, even knowing it was unsafe. But the other thing he did was he replaced the man who was scheduled to be Vasa's captain with the captain who had supervised construction. And you have to remember that this is before any of the mathematical tools that we use today for calculating ship stability or performance were available. The only way that you could evaluate a new ship was you had to sail it in sea. Vasa's initial destination was in sheltered water. It was the summer fleet base at Älvsnabben in the southern part of the Stockholm archipelago. It's sheltered water all the way, no big waves, and so you needed to understand how the ship would sail and who would be the best person to sail the ship in that circumstance. The person who already knows the ship best. And the captain, Søfring Hansen, had already demonstrated he understood what the problem was. So replacing Hans Jonsson, the man who was supposed to be Vasa's captain, with Søfring Hansen is actually a very good idea. That's sound reasoning there. The ship cast off from the palace, which is where the palace is today, and the wind was blowing very weakly out of the south. And the first part of the journey was directly southward. You had to sail along or move the ship along the front of the town, what we call the old town now, but just the town then. You get to a place we call Slussen now, which is the outflow from Lake Mälaren. There's a current about 1 knot. You can pick up that current and use it to carry you down the harbor. And I think they chose to sail on this day because the wind was so weak, knowing the ship was unstable. They only had 4 of the ship's 10 sails even bent onto the yards. The other 6 sails were still rolled up or folded up and in storage in the bottom of the ship. So you had the absolute minimum amount of sail area you needed to move and maneuver the ship, sailing on a day with minimal wind. And because the wind is coming from the south, the high ground to the south of the town essentially creates a big wind shadow over that part of the harbor where the current is at its strongest. So you'd be able to pick up the current and basically drift with the current along the face of the cliffs. But once you get down to Tegelviken, there is a gap in the high ground to the south. It acts like a giant wind funnel or a venturi. It takes all the wind that's coming from the south and funnels it out into the harbor in that one place. And everybody who sails here knows that. I know Søfring Hansen had to know that. He'd been sailing in and out of Stockholm harbor for 25 years. And so you know that there's going to be a much stronger wind just there for the space of about 100 to 200 meters that you have to be prepared for. The accounts say that the ship heeled once, either because of a first gust of wind or because everybody on deck moved to one side of the ship to look at the shore. But it righted itself, probably painfully slowly. Anybody who was on board who was an experienced mariner knew at that point they were in trouble because the ship did not recover from that very, very light gust the way a healthy, well-designed ship should recover. And then once they got in front of Tegelviken, in front of the wind funnel, the wind comes out not just stronger, but it also comes out pointing down a little bit. The sails filled and the ship heeled over so far that the lower gun ports were in the water. The gun ports were open because you had to fire a salute when you were leaving harbor. Also, if you've built the most powerfully armed warship in the world, but everybody, including all the spies of Northern Europe, know it's been delayed a year because you can't get the guns together to arm it. You can't sail with the gun ports closed. You have to show off that you've actually armed the ship. So the guns are run out, the ports are open, and the lowest gun ports on the ship are only about 1.25 meters above the water. The ship only has to heel about 12 degrees to one side before water will come in through the gun ports. And that's what happened. In front of Tegelviken, the ship heeled 12, maybe 15 degrees, and water keeps pouring into the ship until it fills the ship and the ship goes to the bottom.
And just like that, Sweden's grand warship, meant to be a symbol of power, was gone, sinking right in front of a stunned crowd. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, in many ways, it was just the beginning.
Most of the people on board survived. We don't know exactly how many are on board. We assume at least 150, maybe as many as 250, because we don't know how many guests there were. because nobody took account of those. We know how big the sailing crew should be. Only about 30 people died, and it was reported at the time that the people who died are the people who were trapped inside the ship, because the ship was only 120 meters from shore, and it was a warm summer day with very little wind. If you could swim, you just swam to shore. If you couldn't swim, even after the ship came to rest on the bottom, the upper parts of the masts were up above the water. There was plenty of rigging to hold on to until a boat could pick you up. And the accounts indicate that there were a lot of small boats that were following Vasa down the harbor. And they came in and picked up a lot of people out of the water and saved them.
How long did it stay like that? You know, with the mast sticking out of the water?
We believe that the upper masts were taken down that fall as part of this attempt to salvage the ship. Because it sank in the narrowest part of the shipping channel, it was a hazard to navigation, and that had to be cleared away. And so the upper masts and the upper sails and all of that upper rigging were recovered.
Did they have the technology to actually access the ship when it was on the bottom of the harbor?
The ship was readily accessible. The water is about 32 meters deep, and so it was accessible to free divers, breath hold divers. And so they put divers on the wreck. Within 2 days, there had been a contract, or a privilege contract, given to an English engineer, Ian Bulmer, who claimed he could raise the ship. And raising sunken ships was a well-known art. Bulmer succeeded in getting the ship upright again. It came to rest leaning probably 15 or more degrees to port. And the first step was to get it upright again, which he succeeded in doing. Probably, we don't know, but the most likely scenario is that they would anchor another ship to the side away from which it was leaning, and then attach cables to the masts and take those to capstans on the anchored ship and use the capstans on the anchored ship to rotate the ship back up. They got it upright, and then they attempted to raise the ship using a method that had been developed already in the 15th century, which was you park 2 ships at the surface, you fasten a lot of anchors into the sunken ship and take their cables up to the 2 ships on the surface. You pump the 2 ships on the surface full of water until they're as low in the water as you can safely go. Tighten all the cables, and then bail or pump the water out of the 2 ships to the surface. And you can then use the reserve buoyancy of those ships to lift the sunken ship. Vasa, out of the water, weighed something like 1,250 tons. But completely submerged in the water, it weighs less than 200 tons because of displacement, the buoyancy of all of that stuff. And so you didn't need a lot of lifting force. You could easily generate that much lifting force with 2 other warships, which was what they used, 2 big ships anchored to the surface. The problem was the ship was embedded in the clay of the harbor bottom, very sticky, and the enormous surface area and the suction between the clay and the ship's hull was too much to overcome. So the force you would need to exert to lift the ship was substantially more than the amount they could lift with the ships of the surface. The ships of the surface did succeed in breaking the cables to the lifting anchors. And so they lost a lot of anchors in repeated attempts to raise the ship. When Vasa was found, or in the 1950s and 1960s, they recovered over 40 anchors from the site, most of them from the 1620s, all of the same pattern, probably made at the Navy Yard for raising the ship.
Did they make any effort to recover valuables, like the cannons or?
They did succeed in recovering most of the cannon. About 35 years after the ship sank, by that point the ship was no longer valuable, but the guns, which had cost more than the ship, were still a lot of money lying on the bottom, even if you only raised them for their scrap value, because they were bronze. Copper was expensive. It cost 8 times as much as iron. And so 2 entrepreneurs using a diving bell and professional divers over the course of 3 years, 1663 to 1665, succeeded in recovering almost all of Vasa's guns. We only have 3 left of the 64 here in the museum. The others were all raised and then exported and melted down again.
It's a pretty important part of the story, these attempts to raise it back then. I had no idea. And it's interesting that, well, eventually they succeeded, I mean, centuries later, but what was the reason that they rose the Vasa in the modern age?
The ship was not really forgotten. There are mentions of it in all the histories of the Navy written after it sank. It appears on the harbor charts in the middle of the 19th century, as a wreck. There were divers who claimed to have visited it in the 1840s, the 1860s, the 1890s, and even that the Swedish Navy, which established its diving school on the island of Kastelholmen, about 100 meters from the wreck, used it as a training place for divers in the early part of the 20th century, maybe up until World War I. And then in the 1950s, the city of Stockholm decided that they needed a bridge over the lower part of the harbor, basically an early bypass for traffic around Stockholm. And the place they were going to put that was from Tegelviken over to Beckholmen, basically right over the spot where Vasa sank. And so through the summer and fall of 1955, they had taken hundreds of soundings in the area where they thought they wanted to put the bridge. And that essentially made a contour map of the bottom that showed that 120 meters off of Beckholmen, there was a lump in the bottom, about 50 meters long and 6 meters high. They dragged the grapnel together in August of 1956, struck something, sent the plummet down. It came back with a sample of black oak, that is waterlogged oak that had been underwater for hundreds of years. They said, well, that could be anything, but if it's Vasa, it's going to be big. So they dragged some more and moved over about 20 meters and dropped the plummet again and got another sample of black oak. So now they knew there was a big wooden thing on the bottom in the spot where Vasa was supposed to have sunk. And that was enough information for Franz Sane to go to the Navy and say, can we get divers to investigate that? And in September of 1956, Felting and another diver descended to the bottom. The other diver landed in the middle of the wreck and had no idea where he was. Felting landed next to the wreck and could orient himself and walked towards it and then walked right into a wooden wall stretched well above his head. And he reports, as he reported over the dive telephone, because he was wearing an old style Dangerous Diver Dan helmet suit, that there's a wooden wall here with raised planks running along it. There's a square opening, a little less than a meter. Here's another square opening, a little less than a meter. Here's another one. Then he climbed up on the side, said, well, now there's another row of these square openings above the lower row. So he said, I think we're here. So we found a warship with 2 rows of gun ports. And they're only one of those that sank in that part of the harbor is Vasa. To raise the ship, basically the same procedure that Bulmer had attempted in 1628. Although in this case, instead of fastening anchors into the ship, they dug 6 tunnels under the ship and passed cables under the ship. That broke the suction with the bottom. And they successfully lifted the ship in August of 1959 and then moved it into shallower water to prepare it for the final lift. And as part of that preparation for the final lift, they partially excavated the uppermost surviving deck, the upper gun deck, in order to lighten the ship and to make sure that it wouldn't roll over once they got it to the surface. And in the course of clearing the upper gun deck, they encountered the remains of 5 different people. Eventually, after the ship was raised and explorations were finished in the area where the ship had sunk, archaeologists and divers would recover the remains of 15 or 16 people. The bodies had decomposed. Most of them had been reduced to skeletons, although a lot of them still had clothing remains associated with them. Some of the bodies had been disturbed. The gun salvage in the 1660s, we know, disturbed at least 2 of the bodies because they were next to a cannon that was they were in the way. And then the salvage operation in 1960, clearing that upper deck, had also disturbed some of the bodies. But the ones that were undisturbed were still very well located. 2 of them still looked like people. The first of those that they found on the upper gun deck was the one that had not been disturbed. It's possible for us to see from the excavation photographs that that was a man who died in a sitting position, leaning against a bulkhead, and then slumped over to his left side.
While the recovery of the victims was somber, the ship itself still had one final journey. But how do you move a massive 17th century warship that was underwater for over 300 years?
When the ship was raised, it was refloated on its own keel. The oldest ship ever successfully refloated after 333 years underwater. And it was in sufficiently good condition that it could stay afloat with a lot of pumping for just long enough to get it into a dry dock, where it was placed on a concrete pontoon so that it could be moved around the harbor once the excavation was finished, because they realized it would need a temporary home for conservation and then a permanent home. And the best solution for that was to put it on essentially a big barge, and the barge would float and then it could be moved. So that barge was initially tied up at what became the restoration facility and museum, which was called the Vasa Shipyard. And it was there for 27 years, through the 1960s, 70s, and most of the 80s, while it was conserved, restored, reassembled. And then this museum, construction started in 1987, and the site chosen was over a dry dock. So the central part of the museum was a functioning dry dock. And so to get the ship into the museum, we did not build the museum over the ship. Instead, the museum was built except for one wall, which is at the entrance end of the dry dock. And in December of 1988, the ship was moved about 200 meters from where it had been restored and brought into the dry dock. We call it Vasa's only successfully completed voyage. And it had about 30 centimeters of clearance on either side to get into the end of the building. It was brought into the dry dock. The dry dock was closed and then drained. So the pontoon or the barge came to rest on a forest of concrete pillars set up in the bottom of the dry dock. And that's where it is today. The pontoon is still there. It still sits on 50 or so concrete pillars. And then the barge itself, the pontoon, is our main storage area.
So we've covered the context in which the Vasa was built, its flawed design, disastrous sinking, and incredible recovery process. But now it's time to take a quick stroll through the museum to see firsthand what this ship looks like up close.
Towards the aft of the ship were the quarter galleries. These were effectively small decorative balconies that were not really useful in function, more a status symbol to the people who occupied the cabins that they connected to. They would have been cramped and impractical. So what about those openings in the center deck? Well, those were the hatches. They provided a way to load and unload cargo, but also ventilation for the crew. Now, when it rained, they would obviously close them to keep everything as dry as possible. The upper deck was intended to be a very active and busy workspace. 2 watches of about 60 men each would take turns sailing the ship to and from its destination. That would have been the case if it didn't go down like the Titanic anyways. Now the anchor itself was lifted with something called a capstan. It is that large rotating wheel. Men would actually physically push the crank to raise it up and down. This is the foremast. It's huge, and we're only seeing a fraction of what once was. In fact, the original foremast was 46 meters tall, and it was made of 3 overlapping elements. At the top was a flagstaff, and only the lowest segment of that piece survived. Also important to note is that this mast was the most important of all when it came to maneuvering and raising the anchor. Now, this next feature is my least favorite for sure. The Polish enemy. Why is it my least favorite? Because I'm a proud Polish national. Anyhow, the idea here is that a Polish nobleman trapped under a cathead, which is the beam that would control the anchors. It was a sign of extreme humiliation, but apparently the crew was pretty excited about it. Now, another fascinating part of the ship is the bowsprit, which had a sail. At the very, very tip, a sail was set. 2 small sailors would operate it, and that would help steer this massive wooden ship.
It's fascinating to think that a country like Sweden, renowned for over 200 years of neutrality, takes such pride in a warship. After all, it was built as a symbol of military power during a time when Sweden sought dominance in the Baltic region. Hence, as my final question, I asked Mr. Hocker, a newly naturalized citizen of the country, what this monument represents to Swedes in the modern day.
Vasa has an interesting position in modern Swedish society. Everybody in Sweden knows about it. Most Swedes visit here as school children. Almost every school class, even from quite far away in Sweden, will come here at some point and visit the ship. We like to joke that every Swede comes here twice, once when they're in school and once as an adult when they have their first visit from overseas. That this country took the world's least successful warship and made it the centerpiece of the world's most successful maritime museum. Something like 1 out of every 3 or 4 foreigners that visit Sweden every year comes to this museum. And so a big part of Sweden's international image comes out of this museum. This is Sweden's Apollo project. It was this unthinkable technical achievement that no sane person would have believed possible. But through determination and optimism and innovation and skill, Sweden pulled it off, bringing this ship back to the surface and restoring it so that people can see that.
We're going to wrap it up there for today, but special thanks to the Vasa Museum for allowing me to record this. If you guys would like to see an extended cut of that interview that I did with Fred, check it out over on the Patreon page. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Sokesh, signing off.